All right, class. So I'm back for the second recording here. You can basically think of this as Friday's lecture. We're going to finish our discussion of fetal development, and we're going to spend a few minutes talking about how the human body continues to develop and mature after birth, and then what the aging process looks like. We're not going to spend too much time on aging, but we'll spend a few minutes looking at basically the biological reasons why the human body grows old, right? And why some of the processes start to slow down and that kind of thing. So remember in the previous recording, I left off talking about fetal development, and specifically the last structures that we looked at were the fetal circulatory system, right? Remember, we've got the ductus venosus, ductus arteriosus. That's the bypass between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. And then we have the foramen ovale, which allows blood, fetal blood, to pass from the right atrium to the left atrium. Both of those work together to allow fetal blood to bypass the lungs because it's the baby's already getting oxygenated blood from the mother. And so its lungs are actually deflated, and you're not able to pass blood through those capillary beds, okay? The next thing we want to look at in fetal development, I think this is really interesting, really, I would say really relevant to our world today, and you'll start to see why that is. And that concept is really how the fetus develops into, in most cases, either a male or a female, okay? So in the body, right, in animal systems in general, there are special proteins called transcription factors. And if you were to take like a genetics class, you would learn that transcription factors are basically regulating which genes on the chromosomes are being transcribed. Basically, you know that there's a whole bunch of genes on a chromosome, right? Each location on a chromosome is a gene that basically encodes for a specific protein, okay? So that's what a gene is. And you've got transcription factors that are helping to regulate which genes, basically which genes are being turned on or off. You can kind of think of it that way, okay? One really, really important transcription factor that has a role to play in sex determination is a transcription factor that we call testes determining factor. So I've added actually some pretty extensive kind of supplementary notes here on this slide. I'm not going to test you over this stuff, but it is, like I said, it's really relevant to our world today. And so I really would like you to have an understanding of at least the basics of how biological sex determination happens, okay? So basically, you know, at fertilization, you receive an X chromosome from your mom, right? So all of the female cells are going to be XX. And so when meiosis happens and produces an oocyte in the female system, you're left with a single X chromosome, right? And when that meiosis division is happening, it doesn't matter which daughter cell becomes the oocyte. Both daughter cells are going to have an X chromosome, right? Females are XX. So you can't inherit anything other than an X chromosome from your mom, okay? Sometimes you might inherit two X chromosomes from your mom, and that's a different story. But you're never going to inherit a Y chromosome from your mom, okay? Sperm, on the other hand, can either carry an X chromosome or a Y chromosome. And so it's going to depend on whether an X sperm or a Y sperm fertilizes the oocyte. That's going to determine genetically whether the fetus is going to be a male or a female, okay? So if you get an X from your dad, you're going to genetically be a female, XX. If you get a Y from your dad, you're going to be genetically a male, okay? And so basically what happens is that, and I'm referring to my notes again here because there's quite a few details to pay attention to. Basically what happens is that at about the 7 or 8 week mark, okay, 7 or 8 weeks, so we're just about at the 2-month mark after fertilization, 7 or 8 weeks, there's a narrow window of time when basically a certain set of genes on the Y chromosome become activated, and those activated genes produce a transcription factor that we call testes determining factor, TDF. Okay, this region of genes only occurs on the Y chromosome, and it's called the you see it on the slide here. It's called the sex determining region on the Y chromosome. Okay, so this process, what we're looking at is what happens if you got the Y chromosome from your dad. Okay, this isn't going to happen if you got the X chromosome. Okay, if you got X chromosome from your dad and you obviously got an X chromosome from your mom, you don't have an SRY region because you don't have a Y chromosome. Okay, but if you got a Y chromosome from your dad, at about the 7 or 8 week mark, the genes in this sex determining region on the Y chromosome start expressing a transcription factor, and that specific transcription factor is called testis determining factor. Okay, if testis determining factor, if that transcription factor is secreted, it is very briefly going to turn on the cell machinery that we need in order to begin development of the male reproductive tract. Okay, and the rest of the male reproductive organs. All right, so there's a narrow window of time where the SRY region of genes have to turn on secretion of testes determining factor. So there's basically two ways that you can develop biologically into a female, right? The female system is actually the default system of the human body, okay? If there's no Y chromosome, or if for some reason testis determining factor is not secreted, or if testis determining factor for some reason isn't recognized or it doesn't do its job, then it is possible actually for you to be genetically male, but biologically you develop as a female, because the default condition for the human body is female. And if that narrow window of time comes and goes, and there's not a successful secretion of testis determining factor, and the resulting sort of domino effects of cellular processes that it triggers, then the fetus is actually going to develop as a female, regardless of whatever whether there's a presence of the Y chromosome or not. Okay, the end result is the same. We didn't have testis determining factor turning on that the chain reaction of development steps that lead to development of a male reproductive system. Okay, so it's really important for you to understand that it's actually, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's actually fairly common for individuals to develop kind of an indeterminate sex biologically. Okay, I might have mentioned this briefly in lecture last week, but or the week before. Basically, in as many as 1 or even 2% of the population will have a baby that's born that's not clearly male or clearly female, and there's a whole variety of reasons why this can happen. But one of the more common reasons that this can happen is that maybe a baby received a Y chromosome from the dad, but for whatever reason, that narrow time window at the 7 or 8 week mark post-fertilization, that narrow time window came and went, and there was either no secretion of TDF, or TDF was secreted, but for some reason, maybe the receptors that are supposed to bind TDF didn't respond in the way that they should have, and that window of time closed, and TDF didn't turn on those cellular mechanisms that lead to development of the male system, and so we have development of the default, which is the female system. Okay, this is pretty common. In fact, just kind of an illustration here, there was a really famous study that was done in England, I want to say kind of in the late 60s, early 70s. And what they did is they were looking at, I believe it was several hundred couples. Again, this is in England. So these are couples, young couples that are trying to start families, and for whatever reason, they're unable to conceive. Okay, so I don't remember the exact numbers. Let's say 500 couples that aren't able to conceive. Okay, and so the researchers in this study basically tracked those couples, and they tried to figure out the biological reasons why they were having trouble conceiving. And it turns out that after they were able to eliminate all the other possible reasons for infertility, maybe there was a low sperm count, maybe the hormone timing and things were a little bit off in either the male system or the female system. After they were able to rule out all those other common causes of infertility, what they were left with is basically a subpopulation of the study group that for some reason these women were never ovulating. Okay, so what they noticed is that in all these women that were left, where we had weeded out all the other reasons for infertility, we were left with a group of women that never ovulated. And what they did is that they performed X-rays, abdominal X-rays on these women. They actually found that these women did not have ovaries. What they actually had was testes, internal testes, that never descended, right? So basically, phenotypically, externally, the external genitalia looked female. In every other way, these were anatomically, these were women, right? But when they started looking into, reasons why, okay, why are we seeing external female structures, but internally we know actually that these people have testes instead of ovaries. What they found was that there was a failure of TDF either to be secreted or to be recognized, and it was that TDF that should have stimulated the typical male anatomical features that we're used to seeing. Okay, there's a number of other physiological reasons why an individual's anatomical or physiological sex may be not clearly male or not clearly female, or why the external reproductive organs may not necessarily match an individual's genetic sex, right? One of those I mentioned briefly in my first recording was that sometimes you can actually inherit an extra X chromosome. So there are individuals that are born with actually 3 sex chromosomes. They have 2 X's and a Y. And so because you have that Y chromosome present, you have an SRY region, and you're probably going to develop as a male. But you also have 2 X chromosomes, and so there are some features that develop more akin to what we would think of as typical female structures. So a lot of times these are men that have penises and scrotums, testes, facial hair, right? But they may also have breast tissue, for example. Okay, and they may have facial structures that we would think of as being a little more feminine than masculine. Okay, there are other reasons as well. So I want you to just be aware of this concept that biological sex is definitely not always simply black and white, male and female, right? There's a gradient there, and it's actually more common than you might realize for individuals to fall somewhere in the middle, somewhere in that blurry kind of gray area between classically male and classically female. So just wanted you to be aware of that. All right. Let's see. So and again, a lot of those details here I provided for you in the kind of supplemental notes. Continuing on to the next slide here, the reproductive tracts actually develop out of, they develop very closely hand in hand with the urinary tract, actually. And so if you were to look at the sort of the fetal development, the embryological development of the urinary tract, what you see is that the developing urinary tract actually goes through 3 separate phases. We actually have what's called an early kidney, and then that early kidney gets replaced by what's called a mesonephros. Nephros means kidney, so basically an early kidney, a middle kidney, and then we've got a metanephros or a late kidney. The mesonephros, that middle kidney, and the metanephros, the later kidney, those 2 phases of the urinary system each have their own tube systems. right? And depending on whether whether the developing fetus is a male or a female, the tubular systems of either the mesonephros, the middle kidney, or the metanephros, the later kidney, those tubular structures are actually going to become either the male reproductive tract or the female reproductive tract. And so this picture actually shows, starting up here at the top left, we see the early gonads here. These are going to become either the ovaries or the testes. Okay, and then you actually see not one but two pairs of tubes kind of coming off of those early gonads. Okay, one of them is called the Mullerian duct, and the other is the Wolffian duct. Don't need you to memorize those. Just know that one of those is, associated with the mesonephros, the middle kidney. One of those is associated with the metanephros, the late kidney. Okay. If you have a Y chromosome, and if the SRY, the sex determining region of the Y chromosome, produces TDF, the fetus is going to develop as a male. And what's going to happen is that I believe it's the Mullerian duct, is going to break apart and disintegrate. And you're going to be left with the Wolffian duct here. And the Wolffian duct is going to form the vas deferens, which, remember, is that tube that carries the sperm from where they're produced in the testes to the urethra and then out through the penis, right? So the vas deferens develops out of the Wolffian duct, which is I believe that's the metanephros. So I'm never going to test you on that. Okay. If you don't have a Y chromosome, if you've got two X chromosomes, then the gonads are going to develop into ovaries, obviously. The Wolffian duct is going to break apart and disintegrate. You see the purple structure here is kind of breaking apart. And the pink structure, the Mullerian duct, is going to develop, and those are going to become the fallopian tubes. Okay. The fallopian tubes actually fuse together and they form what's called the uterus, right? And the uterus eventually will kind of connect with the with the vagina and kind of come together in kind of a shared opening with the urinary tract here. Okay. So what I want you to notice here is that even though the oviducts, the fallopian tubes, and the vas deferens, even though they serve a very similar function, that is carrying the reproductive cells, either the egg or the sperm, from the gonads, either the ovaries or the testes, to the reproductive tract, even though they serve a very similar function, they're actually not homologous. In other words, they don't develop out of the same tissue. They actually develop out of different tissues. Okay, so the fallopian tubes develop out of different tissue than the vas deferens do. Okay, so they're analogous. They serve a similar. They have a very similar structure, very similar function, but they're not derived out of the same tissue. Compare that to the secondary reproductive structures, the penis and the vagina, right? And the scrotum. Those structures actually are homologous. They do develop out of the same tissues. So here, if we look at the structures as they're developing from about the 4-week mark to the 6-week mark, you see kind of a sexual gender ambiguous, right? Undifferentiated sex here. And it's not until the 6-week mark where we see differentiation between male and female structures. Okay. So you'll see that the structure that's going to become the head of the penis, what we call the glans penis, is homologous to what's going to become the clitoris in the female system. Okay, the tissue that forms the shaft of the penis, shown here in purple, is actually going to become the inner lips of around the vulva, right? So the labia minor are homologous. They're developed out of the same tissue as the shaft of the penis. Okay, and then the scrotum, shown here in kind of a light pink, is homologous, derived from the same tissue as the labia major. So the external lips around the vulva are homologous to the scrotum. Okay, so I would like you to know those homologous structures. Scrotum is homologous to the external set of lips around the vulva, the labia major. The shaft of the penis is analogous to the internal lips around the vulva, the labia minor. And then the clitoris here is analogous to the glans penis, or the head of the penis. Okay, so homologous structures for the external genitalia, analogous, which means similar in structure, but actually coming out of different tissues for the internal reproductive tracts in the male and female reproductive system. Okay. Be sure to email me if you've got questions on that. The questions I'm going to ask on the test are going to be very, very simple. I basically want you to be aware of this just for your own curiosity's sake, and so that you have kind of a foundational understanding of sexual differentiation and the potential for sexual ambiguities in individuals, and kind of the biological basis for that. All right, so we're going to transition then for the rest of this lecture to looking at how the baby grows and develops after birth, and then through childhood, young adulthood, and then into aging as an adult. So things that you can do during the pregnancy, obviously, if you or your partner ever become pregnant, you're going to want to be aware of everything that you can possibly do to make sure that the pregnancy is healthy and successful for both the mother and for the baby. It's going to be really important that you regularly are seen by a physician or possibly by a midwife, right? Quality prenatal care is really, really important during the pregnancy process, right? You're going to want to monitor the weight of the baby, the size of the baby as it's developing. That's going to be really important to catch any potential complications early, so that you can deal with them appropriately. Healthy diet and exercise and healthy sleep schedule is going to be really important for keeping the baby and the mom healthy. Going to be really, really important that that the mom is avoiding exposure to smoke and alcohol and any other drugs, even prescription drugs. A lot of times you'll need to be extra careful. You want to be consulting your doctor about whether or not you should be taking pharmaceutical medications during a pregnancy, because there are certain pharmaceutical drugs you'll want to avoid as well. You'll want to avoid exposure to certain nutritional supplements and exposure to X-rays. Okay, you want to avoid sexually transmitted diseases, right? And if you're aware that you have an STD, you're going to want to make sure to be upfront about that with your doctor, so that they can help you decide, how to minimize the risk of that STD that it might pose to the baby, right? There are also, along with, we mentioned proper nutrition, proper diet. A lot of times there are certain vitamins, things like folic acid and other vitamins that are super important, that the mother's getting in adequate amounts. So they have like prenatal multivitamins that you can take. That's another important thing that you can do to make sure that the baby has all the critical nutrients that it needs to be able to develop appropriately. There will be certain changes that are happening during pregnancy, especially in the first trimester. It's pretty common to have problems with nausea and vomiting, right? We call this morning sickness a lot of times. Usually that's limited to, or at least the worst of it's limited to the first trimester. A lot of times there will be actually an increase in energy level and kind of a general sense of well-being that the mom is feeling. A lot of that comes from just the, the hormones and the endorphins and just the excitement about looking forward to the baby that's on the way. You think about that, baby is taking up all this space in the mother's abdomen, right? And displacing internal organs, right? And so along with that, especially as the baby grows larger, we can see problems with acid reflux. So there's pressure being put on the mother's stomach, kind of displacing some of that stomach acid out of the stomach, up the esophagus, right? There can be problems. Maybe the baby is kind of pinching off the intestines to a certain degree, so you can have issues with constipation. So these are all things that a doctor and a midwife can help you kind of navigate. The mother's body obviously is taking care of this developing baby, right? So there's going to be an increase in blood volume, right? There's also an increase in lung capacity as well. The mother's lungs actually are able to take in a larger volume of air than they normally do to provide that extra oxygen for the increased volume of blood that you're sharing with the baby. You're going to see peripheral swelling. We call this edema, right? Edema is collection of fluids in the tissues. This is not, out of the ordinary for mothers during pregnancy. Kind of expected. You might develop varicose veins, stretch marks. Okay, your belly is being stretched as the baby grows, and the skin isn't able to grow fast enough to keep up with that. So as the skin is stretched, a lot of times you'll see stretch marks from that. There are things that you can do to kind of minimize that. I believe, sometimes mothers will use like shea butter, other types of things, moisturizers to kind of try to minimize the development of stretch marks. There will be a weakening of the bladder, or not so much a weakening, but additional pressure being put on the urinary bladder. And so a leaky bladder, right, incontinence is a common issue, especially later in pregnancy as well. Obviously weight gain, right? Not only because of the baby and the amniotic fluids and the placenta, right, but also just fat reserves actually are going to be increasing basically all over the mother's body, and that's natural. That's the way it's supposed to happen. There's a pretty noticeable. Typically, there's a pretty noticeable weight gain in the mother as well. Some potentially serious complications that you want to watch out for. My mom, when she was pregnant with some of my siblings, developed what's called gestational diabetes. Gestational diabetes is when a woman who doesn't normally have diabetes develops temporary diabetes during the pregnancy. So that's why we call it gestational diabetes. Basically, a lot of the hormones that are coming into play during the pregnancy, progesterone and other pregnancy hormones, can actually cause issues with the body's response to insulin. We don't completely understand how this works, but we think that these hormones basically are interfering with the proper function of insulin. So maybe the cells, for example, in your liver or in your muscle tissue, are becoming desensitized to insulin, or for some other reason, they're not responding the way that they should to insulin. And so the mother's blood glucose levels can increase out of the normal healthy range. You want to make sure to be aware of gestational diabetes and be working with a doctor to manage it, because if gestational diabetes is not properly controlled, not properly managed, it can put you at higher risk of developing what's called preeclampsia. And preeclampsia is basically elevated, high increased blood pressure in the mom, and that can actually put the pregnancy itself at risk. So you want to take both of those really, really seriously. They're not, it's definitely not the end of the world. These are both very common complications during pregnancy, but it's important to work with a physician to manage gestational diabetes and preeclampsia so that you can make sure that the mom and the baby are going to be come out of this pregnancy healthy. Okay. All right, as we approach the end of the third trimester and we're getting ready for birth, we enter a phase called labor, right? So labor involves contractions of those very strong, smooth muscle walls of the uterus. When uterine contractions are happening at least every 15 to 20 minutes, and they're lasting for a minimum of 40 seconds each, that's where we actually refer to, proper labor. Okay. Prior to that, it's pretty common to have, even several weeks before pregnancy, you can have infrequent, kind of irregular contractions. Those are called Braxton Hicks contractions. And again, they're infrequent, they're irregular, they're not happening with, any kind of rhythm, it's not like they're happening every 20 minutes or something. No pattern really. They're irregular, they're infrequent, and they're happening several weeks before the due date. Those are Braxton Hicks. But when those contractions become pretty frequent, every 15 to 20 minutes, and they're lasting at least 40 seconds, that's when we say that a woman's gone into labor. Okay. There are basically 3 stages of labor, and this is, these points are points that I would expect to maybe see on the test. So make sure that you're familiar with the 3 stages of labor. First stage is called early labor. Okay, this is where we see dilation of the cervix. Remember, the cervix is the opening to the uterus. So if the uterus is kind of a triangular shape, this bottom portion down where my fingers are, that's going to be the cervix. So as the cervix starts to dilate, we measure the distance of that cervical opening. And if the dilation of the cervix is anywhere from 0 to 7 centimeters, so 7 centimeters is, something like an inch or so, we would call that early labor. Okay, and this is usually several hours to even days before birth. Okay. Second stage of labor is called transition and delivery. Okay, so this is where we see pretty dramatic, intense contractions of the uterus. These contractions are coming pretty often, about once every 1 to 2 minutes, and they last about 1 or 2 minutes. So they're very long contractions, they're prolonged contractions, and they're happening pretty frequently. We also see that the cervix is open it's dilated more than 7 centimeters, 7 to 10 centimeters. So that's something like this, right? Really important that the baby is oriented with the head down toward the cervix. Okay, we want the head to be the first thing to come out, followed by the shoulders. Okay, after the baby emerges, then we clamp off and cut the umbilical cord. Okay, and that marks the end of the second stage of labor. Third stage of labor here is the afterbirth. Okay, this is easy to forget because we've already had the baby come out, right? The third stage of labor is the afterbirth. This is where the placenta is actually delivered. And this happens actually approximately 15 minutes after the baby is born. So even after the mom's pushed out the baby, she's not completely done, right? She needs to actually deliver the placenta, the afterbirth. And that's the third stage of labor. So here's a picture of what that looks like. Here's early labor. Okay, you see that the cervix is just starting to dilate here. This is somewhere between 0 and 7 centimeters dilated. Okay, here's the second stage, right? Transition and delivery. So obviously, if the baby's head is coming out, the cervix is well dilated at that point, right? Something like 10 centimeters or so. And then here's that third stage where the baby's already come out. We've clamped off the umbilical cord, but we need to actually deliver the placenta. The placenta needs to come out as well. And that happens maybe 15 or so minutes after the baby's born. So if you think this is interesting and you want to learn a little bit more about human development, we've got a couple of links here to really interesting videos that you can watch on your own time. I'd highly encourage you to check that out. Not going to be tested on it, but it's just there for your own curiosity. Okay, so after birth, we want to take a little bit of a look at childhood development here. Early childhood, obviously, we see the baby starting to practice and develop new skills. Baby will learn to, roll over. It'll learn to crawl, maybe sit up, right? Learn to, after it's crawling around a little bit, it'll be trying to figure out how to walk, right? Maybe they'll be a little unsteady at first, but they'll be holding on to couches and, whatever, to steady themselves until they're more stable on their feet. This is kind of happening up until about 2 years of age. Each kid is a little bit different. They're starting to babble. They're starting to experiment with mimicking the sounds that the other people around them are making. So they're developing their language skills, starting at about 2 years and then continuing from there. Obviously, there's pretty substantial physical growth that's happening from about 6 to 12 years. You go through kind of a growth spurt there, and social development as well. Maybe you start kindergarten around 5 years old or so. You're starting to spend more times around kids your own age. You're starting to learn what's kind of socially acceptable and not. You're learning how to interact with the people around you. And then you enter adolescence at puberty. For guys, it happens a little bit later than girls. Guys enter puberty somewhere around 12, 13, 14 years old. Girls are entering puberty usually around 10 to 14 years old. Actually, as we're seeing better diets here in the Western world, we all have pretty good access to nutritional food. We're actually seeing that puberty is happening earlier and earlier, as early as 8 years old. And some girls are hitting puberty at that point. But obviously, this is where the sex hormones, testosterone and estrogen, are starting to increase in circulation, and you see primary and secondary sexual characteristics starting to develop during puberty. This is also a time of pretty significant social and psychological changes, a lot of hormones, right? Really, really important development that's happening in the central nervous system, especially the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, right? Frontal lobe of your brain. Biological aging. We're not going to go into a ton of detail here, partly because we don't know all the details of how this happens. There's kind of 3 main schools of thought, and I would say they're not really mutually exclusive. The actual way that, what am I trying to say? Reality is that we probably are seeing kind of some combination of these 3 processes. But the 3 schools of thought are that aging is mostly genetic. So if you were to take a genetics class, you would learn that basically your chromosomes, if you were to stretch your chromosomes out, kind of uncoil your chromosomes, the start and end of your chromosomes have sections that don't code for anything. They're not genes. They're what's called telomeres. And those telomeres have important roles to play in cell division, but they're not encoding genes. Okay, but every time a cell duplicates its chromosomes to get ready for division, it doesn't actually duplicate the entire telomere. And actually, the telomeres actually get a tiny bit shorter and a tiny bit shorter, tiny bit shorter every time your cells go through cell replication. So one theory is that as those telomeres are shortening, that's the reason why we're aging. Okay, it's called mitochondrial aging. Okay. Well, so mitochondrial aging, that's a little bit different. So your mitochondria might be getting worn out. So anyway, there's a couple of different ways that genetics might be coming into play here. Whole body processes. There are whole body systems that are basically start to wear out, right? You could look at the various different types of tissues as maybe hormone activity is starting to slow, as the sort of the structural integrity of some of the tissues that make up these organ systems starts to become a little less, starts to lose some of its structural integrity. You'll start to see a loss of function in some of the body systems. There might also be extrinsic factors, right? You all know that we're living in a world that has, there's various toxins all around us. There's toxins in the food that you eat, right? Pesticides that are on the food, pesticides that are applied to the food crops. Farmers use some of those pesticides, make their way into our food. You've got things like radiation from the sun. You've got other environmental pollutants, right? One theory is that it's the kind of the cumulative effect of all those external toxins and various sources of potential cellular damage from the outside world that are having kind of a cumulative effect on our overall health as well. So that's another sort of class of factors that might be contributing to biological aging as well. As we become older, kind of regardless of the reasons for that biological aging, we do see that as we become older, our metabolism starts to slow down. You actually start seeing a reduction in cell division, so that you're not replacing cells as quickly as cells are dying. So you actually see the rate of cell death is actually happening at a greater pace than cell replacement. And so you'll actually see that tissues, including the skin, become thinner. If you've ever noticed your grandparents' skin is pretty thin and inelastic and kind of dry. If an elderly person, if you've worked in a nursing home or if you've been around your grandparents, you might have noticed that if an older person, even like brushes their arm against the doorway that they're passing through, it doesn't take much to rip open their skin and to have pretty significant bleeding from something that definitely wouldn't have ripped open a younger person's skin, right? So the skin becomes thinner and less elastic, more fragile as we age. We also see that fat reserves start to dry up. There's less fat in the skin, and that decreased thermal insulation means that older people have a harder time staying warm. And so a lot of times you'll see older people, wearing long sleeve shirts or even jackets or coats when the rest of us are, plenty warm. We see that melanocyte function slows down. So those are the cells in your integument, the cells in the layers of your skin that produce melanin. They're what give our skin and hair its coloration. But as those melanocytes start to not function the same anymore, we start to lose the pigmentation, the color in our hair. Hair starts to go either white or gray. And you'll also start to see skin spots showing up in an older person's skin. So kind of dark spots on a person's skin. Those are called age spots, and they're due to melanocytes activity levels kind of changing. We'll actually see that the heart becomes a little bit smaller, so that it's having to work harder to pump the same volume of blood through the body. Arteries start to become a little bit more rigid. Depending on your diet, if you're eating a high-fat diet, you might have plaques building up on the inside of your arteries, right? Kind of like if you think about your arteries like your kitchen sink, right? If your kitchen sink becomes clogged, you might call a plumber, and the plumber is going to take apart the pipes under your sink. And if you look inside those pipes, you've got all that kind of grease buildup inside the pipes that has kind of reduced the functional diameter of the pipe. Same thing can happen to your arteries. If you're eating a high-fat diet, you can have fat buildup inside the arteries. We call that plaque. And that, like I said, kind of decreases the diameter, the functional diameter of your arteries, so that your heart is also having to pump harder just to move blood through that smaller diameter. Okay, you're going to see slower reaction time as the neurons that make up the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system aren't working quite as well as they used to. The lens in your eye, so think about the lens that we talked about just behind the pupil, right? We said that it's important to be able to stretch the lens to make it thinner so that you can see distance, objects at a distance, or you can relax the lens so that it kind of bulges and becomes thicker to really focus light coming from objects that are close by, right? So your lens, especially in a younger person, is very flexible. It's very pliable, but as we age, that lens becomes much less pliable, and we can see development of farsightedness. Okay, farsightedness. So you'll see older people that are trying to read something, they have to hold it way away from themselves to be able to focus on it. Okay. With the decreased metabolic activity, we also see a decrease in muscle mass. We tend to see weight gain. Okay, and then in women, we'll see menopause as well. So menopause is the cessation, the end of the normal monthly ovarian and uterine cycles. Okay, so that's going to happen somewhere probably in your 50s or 60s. Again, as our diet improves, as access to good nutrition becomes better and better, more widespread, we're actually seeing that the average age of menopause, the average length of a woman's reproductive life cycle actually is increasing, so that now the average age of the onset of menopause, I believe, is somewhere in the late 50s or early 60s, whereas it used to be, like 10 years earlier than that. It used to be women would enter menopause sometime in their mid to late 40s. Now we're seeing it in their mid to late 50s or even 60s. Okay. All right, you guys, so that's kind of a quick run through of the second half of human development and aging here. Nice summary of the points that you should be familiar with. Remember that I'm going to be gone tomorrow, which is Wednesday, as well as Friday. So I'd like you to watch both of these recordings and be responsible for the material we've discussed. Make sure that you email me if you've got any questions. I will be back in class for our last lecture on Monday. Okay. So what is that? Monday the Monday the 5th is going to be, I'm hoping Monday the 5th is going to be our last lecture. The second half of next week is supposed to be dead week. So Wednesday and Friday, we're supposed to be hopefully focusing on review for your last test. The last test is not going to be cumulative. So the last test is only going to be over fetal development, human development, aging, and then next week, Monday, we'll be talking about cancer. I think we'll only need one day to get through cancer, but it's possible it might spill into kind of a half lecture next Wednesday as well. Okay, but for sure, Friday next week is going to be review as part of Dead Week. All right. So thank you guys for putting up with these recorded lectures. I know it's not ideal, but anyway, had to be done. So looking forward to seeing you back in class on Monday. And again, please be sure to email me if you have any questions over this material. I'll have access to my email in the evenings during our field trip. So I will be watching for your messages and be doing my best to get back to you just as quick as I can. All right, thanks everyone. Hope you have a really good weekend, and we will see you on Monday.